It's perfectly normal for actors and directors to get into creative fights on a movie. Ridley Scott and Harrison Ford butted heads on Blade Runner. Mark Hamill and Rian Johnson disagreed on Luke's characterization in The Last Jedi. Stanley Kubrick and Kirk Douglas disputed the I am Spartacus line in Spartacus, and so on. But sometimes things go just a little too far, and all of a sudden, the director is trying to burn his actor's living quarters down with the actor still inside, or the director is having live birds thrown at the actress, or the actor and director get into an actual fistfight. In this video, I want to take a look at some creative cinematic partnerships that were marked by violence as much as anything else. Most of these examples share two commonalities. 1. There was actual physical violence, though the scale and form will vary. In one case, it's more of an everlasting hatred. And 2, shockingly, all of these movies were completed, and all of them except one were critical or commercial successes, and oftentimes both. A couple are hailed as some of the best movies ever made. Ironically, the one without much physical violence was also the worst of the bunch. Werner Herzog and Klaus Kinski undoubtedly had the most pyrrhic, violent, behind-the-scenes relationship in film history, and I don't think anyone else comes close. The two worked on 5 movies together, and each was a violent conflict. I'm going to read 2 quotes that are perfect encapsulations of how they felt about each other. This is what Kinski wished upon Herzog. Quote, "Big red ants should piss in his eyes, eat his balls, penetrate his asshole, and eat his guts. He should get the plague, syphilis, malaria, yellow fever, leprosy, in vain. The more I wish the most horrible of deaths on him and treat him like the scum of the earth he is, the less I can get rid of him." End quote. And this is what Herzog had to say about Kinski. Quote, "We had a great love, a great bond, but both of us planned to murder each other. Klaus was one of the greatest actors of the century, but he was also a monster and a great pestilence. Every day I had to think of new ways of domesticating the beast." End quote. The partnership between the two men started on the production of 1972's Aguirre, The Wrath of God, considered a true masterpiece and one of the best movies ever made. It was violent from the start. In fact, it was violent even before they started working together. This is a case of knowing what you're getting yourself into. Herzog and Kinski met when the latter was renting a room in the same boarding house that Herzog and his family lived in. The 3 months that Kinski stayed there were hell. In Herzog's words, quote, "We lived in the same large flat for close to 3 months, and, of course, from day one, he terrorized everybody," end quote, and, quote, "I think I was the only one who was not frightened because he was like a tornado, passing into this apartment and destroying it within the first 48 hours in a fit of rage and destroying the entire furniture and the bathroom," end quote. But the role of Aguirre needed somebody who was as mad, as insane as Kinski was. Lope de Aguirre was a Basque Spanish conquistador who was nicknamed El Loco, and he lived up to it. He would seek out El Dorado, the city of gold. He led a mutiny against his own superior and demanded that his men declare him the Prince of Peru, Tierra Firme, and Chile. He renounced his Spanish vassalage and declared war on his monarch, and when he was at the end of his rope and surrounded by his enemies, he killed his own daughter before being shot to death. The violence on the set of Aguirre was preceded by creative differences and an honest-to-God difficult shoot. Herzog had opted to shoot the movie on location in the Peruvian rainforest at Machu Picchu and in the Amazon over 5 weeks. Because of the tiny budget, the cast and crew had to carry all their equipment over mountains and on rafts in order to move from location to location. Along the way, they had to deal with the weather, mud, the difficult living conditions in the jungle, and flooding. They also had to deal with Klaus Kinski. From the start, the two disagreed on how Aguirre should have been played. Kinski wanted a wild, ranting madman, while Herzog desired someone that was quieter, more menacing. According to Herzog, he would intentionally aggravate Kinski and get him riled up, hoping that he would burn out his anger by the time that they started rolling the cameras. Kinski certainly had a lot of anger to burn. In one instance, set off by noises from a hut where the crew was enjoying themselves, Kinski fired 3 shots at them, which blew the tip of a finger off of an extra. These outbursts were emblematic of Kinski, and they would happen on almost every movie that he worked on with Herzog. Then, Kinski, upset that Herzog wouldn't fire someone, tried to leave the movie. In turn, Herzog threatened Kinski, saying, quote, "If you leave the set now, you will reach the next bend of the river, and I will shoot you. We'll have 8 bullets through your head, and the last one is going to be for me," end quote. Kinski stayed. Keep in mind that these two worked on 4 more movies after this. Fitzcarraldo, their 4th movie together, was a deadly, dangerous shoot for reasons I'll cover in another video. Kinski was not the original choice, but after the previous actor, Jason Robards, got sick thanks to, again, filming in the jungle, Herzog brought on Kinski to play Brian Sweeney Fitzgerald, a rubber baron. Kinski got into fights with just about everyone over everything, and his erratic behavior inspired fear in the cast and crew. According to Herzog, the chief of one of the tribes that were hired as extras onto the movie, the Machiguenga, offered to assassinate Kinski, who was despised by them thanks to his abusive, abrasive behavior. Herzog turned him down, saying that he needed Kinski to finish the film. Perhaps he regretted turning the offer down because Herzog later admitted to planning to murder Kinski one night by setting fire to his place while Kinski was still inside. Herzog apparently got as far as trying to actually set the fire before he was attacked by Kinski's dog. Herzog, of course, is not innocent in all of this. His demands of the natives and of the rest of the cast and crew has led to Fitzcarraldo being one of the most arduous, dangerous film shoots ever. Their final movie together would end up being 1987's Cobra Verde, and Kinski would die just 4 years later. Throughout his life, he also antagonized his own family. Of his 3 children, only 1 attended his funeral. In 1999, Herzog released a documentary about Kinski, My Best Fiend. Despite the violence and antagonistic nature, this is also probably one of the greatest partnerships in film history, right up there with Toshiro Mifune and Akira Kurosawa, Robert De Niro and Martin Scorsese, and David Lean and Alec Guinness. The fist fight between George Clooney and David O. Russell on the set of 1999's Three Kings is the stuff of Hollywood legend and is probably the most famous incident of behind-the-scenes violence in Hollywood in recent memory. It was Russell's 3rd film at the time and by far his most expensive. Russell had already built a reputation for something of an independent streak and was difficult to get along with. Still, he was a brilliant director, so Warner Brothers was willing to take a chance. Problems were evident from the beginning, mainly revolving around Russell's directorial style. He had already had his budget cut, his number of shooting days cut, and had some pre-interference from the studio of things he could and could not include in the movie. Despite all that, he preferred to retain his more improvisational directorial style, changing things up as new ideas came to him and requiring long days of the cast and crew. All of that tension was further compounded by the fact that they were filming in the desert. Russell, infamous for his temper, would sometimes lash out at cast and crew. Whenever that happened, George Clooney would almost always come to their defense, which increased tensions between the two men. Clooney did not like how aloof Russell seemed. During one incident, an extra had a seizure and Clooney was incensed that Russell did not seem to care. In another, Russell was yelling at a driver and Clooney told him to stop. But beyond similar on-set incidents, the relationship between the two was frayed from the beginning. For one, Clooney was splitting his time between the movie and his TV role on ER and would only be there for half the week. For 2, Clooney was not Russell's first choice for the role, and Clooney would say as much in one of the many letters that he sent to Russell. Clooney liked the script and would defend Russell to studio execs at Warner Brothers who wanted him to tone it down, though that did not seem to endear him to Russell one iota. Things came to a head when Clooney thought that he saw Russell throw an extra to the ground in rage. Clooney came to the extra's defense and got into an argument with Russell when, all of a sudden, it devolved into an actual fistfight. It was a long time coming and more of a culmination of events than an in the spur of the moment kind of thing. The way Clooney told it, quote, "We started pushing against each other with our heads, so I got him by the throat, and I was yelling at him and he was screaming at me and we were at it," end quote. Clooney vowed never to work with Russell again, but he does have a grudging respect for his work. Russell, meanwhile, has said that they were just passionate, egotistical guys, and while they aren't best friends or anything, they are still on good enough terms with each other. Ice Cube had the most positive take on the situation, saying, quote, "It kind of kicked the set into a different gear where everybody was focused and we finished strong. I wouldn't mind if the director and star got into an argument on all of my movies," end quote. Chinatown is one of the greatest movies ever made with what is arguably the best screenplay ever written, acting from three legends, and directed by a disgraced director who, at the time, was at the top of his game. Made just half a decade after the murder of his wife, Sharon Tate, and their unborn son, Roman Polanski was in a dark place that is fully reflected in Chinatown, arguably his best work. Things would only get darker, but that's beyond the scope of this video. Suffice it to say that any debate of art in spite of artist cannot be had without talking about Roman Polanski. The only person he worked on Chinatown with that Polanski had a decent relationship with was, oddly enough, the producer Robert Evans. Evans is a character unto himself and is the type of producer that preferred to let directors pursue their vision, which might explain why they got along pretty well. But besides him, Polanski would clash with everyone. With screenwriter Robert Towne, he got into it over the ending of the movie. Towne wanted something happier, but Polanski would insist on the darker ending that we got. But with Towne, it was creative clashes. With the two leads of the movie, Jack Nicholson and Faye Dunaway, it was a bit more physical, though not to the extent of George Clooney and David O. Russell. Jack Nicholson and Faye Dunaway were important actors by that point. Nicholson had done movies like Easy Rider, 5 Easy Pieces, and Carnal Knowledge, while Dunaway had starred in Bonnie and Clyde and the Thomas Crown Affair. According to Dunaway, Polanski was something of a dictator on set. In her 1995 memoir, Looking for Gatsby, she recounted an incident where Polanski, apparently incensed by a single strand of hair that was out of place and ruining a shot, plucked it out himself. But that was only the cherry on top. According to Dunaway, quote, "It was not the hair, it was the incessant cruelty that I felt, the constant sarcasm, the never-ending need to humiliate me," end quote. She took her complaints to Evans and, quote, "It was an awful thing, filled with anger and acrimony," end quote. Polanski would be the only director other than Otto Preminger that Dunaway hated working with. Without delving into details, she said, quote, "It was a sadistic act. It came at the end of a very long litany of things that Roman had done mentally and emotionally to me," end quote. But according to Dunaway, Polanski did push it too far with Nicholson one time. Nicholson, a fan of the Lakers, was going back to his trailer to watch a game in between takes. This incensed Polanski, who thought that Nicholson was the reason that they weren't getting a particular shot. But instead of trying to talk to Nicholson, Polanski decided to go nuclear from the get-go. He took a bat to Nicholson's TV, smashing it into pieces. Nicholson, understandably aggrieved, decamped the set, effectively shutting down production for the day. The two would randomly end up at a spotlight in different cars where they exchanged some words. By that point, both had cooled down. In the end, they were all able to create a monumental piece of film, and most of them would go on to have more success in other films. Evans and Polanski would soon run into legal troubles, and Polanski would flee the US for France. The relationship between Alfred Hitchcock and Tippi Hedren is marred by abuses suffered by the latter at the hands of the former. Hitchcock had discovered her when she was in a commercial for some long-gone meal replacement drink called Seago. Hedren signed a 7-year contract with Hitchcock, and in the beginning, all was well. Not really an actress, Hitchcock had her do extensive screen tests, reenacting material from films that he had directed prior. She was an astute and quick learner, and Hitchcock, who once said that all actors should be treated like cattle, was impressed by her. So much so that he would offer her a lead role in one of his most memorable movies now, The Birds. According to Hedren, quote, "I was so stunned. It never occurred to me that I would be given a leading role in a major motion picture. I had great big tears in my eyes," end quote. She would soon have more tears in her eyes, but for vastly different reasons. One notable thing about the abuses suffered by Hedren at the hands of Hitchcock is that while it also occurred behind the scenes as a result of unwanted advances, it was also seen on film. The Birds is a horror film about birds that suddenly turn violent and begin attacking townsfolk in California. In the beginning, perhaps thanks to suddenly being the star for one of the preeminent directors in the world, Hedren was enjoying herself on the movie. But her shooting schedule, 7 days a week for 6 months with 1 afternoon off per week, would not allow for much downtime. One of those weeks, as Hedren would say, would be the worst of her life. There's a scene in The Birds where Hedren is being assailed by said birds in an attic. Hedren had 2 questions about the scene. The first was her motivation. Why would she go to the attic despite knowing what's going on? Hitchcock responded, quote, "Because I tell you to," end quote. Okay, fair enough. He's the director and that is his prerogative. Her next question was about the mechanics of the scene. How would the birds fly at her? Hitchcock responded, quote, "We'll use mechanical birds like we do with the children," end quote. This turned out to be a lie. When Hedren went to do the scene, she found that she would not only be pelted with mechanical birds, she would be pelted with real birds. In her words, quote, "There was a cage with 4 boxes of ravens, gulls, and a few pigeons thrown in. Bird trainers with gauntlets up to their shoulders hurled birds one after the other at me for 1 week. As days went by, it just became worse and worse," end quote. These were live birds, which is why the trainers wore gauntlets to prevent themselves from being pecked or scratched by talons. Despite their beaks being tied with elastic bands, one of the birds had gouged her cheek and nearly taken out an eye. It was too much for Hedren. She, reasonably, broke down in exhaustion. As she noted, she was pelted by these birds every day for a week. In her words, quote, "It was a nightmare. I ended up in a doctor's care for a week. Hitchcock said, 'She can't rest for a week. We have nobody else to film.' The doctor said, 'What are you trying to do, kill her?' I didn't hear Hitchcock's answer," end quote. Despite the traumatic experience, Hitchcock was effusive in his praise for Hedren, and the movie is now considered a classic. Hedren was also willing to work with Hitchcock again, though considering she signed a 7-year contract, it wasn't as though she had much choice. The two would reunite to do 1964's Marnie, which would also be the last movie that they ever did together. Like The Birds, Marnie had a mixed reception during its original release, but is now considered one of the greatest films ever made, with Richard Brody of New Yorker calling Hedren's performance as Marnie Edgar, quote, "one of the greatest in the history of cinema," end quote. Behind the scenes, though, Hitchcock was continually harassing Hedren. In 1973, she described the situation as, quote, "He was too possessive and too demanding. I cannot be possessed by anyone," end quote. It wasn't until in 1983, 22 years after being discovered by Hitchcock, that she delved into his treatment of her for Donald Spaudu's book on Hitchcock, The Dark Side of Genius. The book portrayed a man that was intensely possessive of Hedren, hiring people to keep track of her whereabouts, telling her what she could eat, who she could see, and forbidding others from touching her unless it was for a scene. He even forbade Hedren's daughter, Melanie Griffith, from seeing her mother. In Hedren's words, quote, "He was really isolating me from everyone," end quote, and it was something that others, from co-stars to friends, noticed as well. Seeing no way out, Hedren made the difficult decision to stop working with him after Marnie. When she demanded to be released from her contract, Hitchcock refused. Despite it all, Hedren has remained remarkably level-headed about her relationship with him, saying, quote, "I've been able to separate the two. The man who was the artist. I mean, what he gave to the motion picture industry can never be taken away from him, and I certainly would not want to try. But on the other side, there's that dark side. That was really awful," end quote. You know things are bad when there are documentaries about how troubled your film production is. Fitzcarraldo has Burden of Dreams, Apocalypse Now has Hearts of Darkness, a filmmaker's apocalypse, Dune has Jodorowsky's Dune, and 1996's The Island of Dr. Moreau has Lost Soul, the doomed journey of Richard Stanley's Island of Dr. Moreau. The 1996 film is better remembered now for what a disaster it was at all stages as opposed to any artistic merit. It starred Marlon Brando and Val Kilmer, both of whom were difficult to work with and had massive egos, a script that kept being rewritten, a constantly increasing budget, a directorial change after 3 days, suffered a hurricane, and more. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and one of the screenwriters described it as such, quote, "It was an island of crazy people, an awful experience," end quote. Oddly enough, though, it wasn't Marlon Brando that caused the most consternation. By 1996, Brando had a long-standing reputation for being something of a pain in the ass. For decades, he refused to learn his lines, so they had to be written on cue cards, fed to him through an earpiece, or, sometimes, written on his co-stars' foreheads. No, it was Val Kilmer that was the real issue. His role was supposed to be played by Bruce Willis, but Willis bowed out as he was about to be in the middle of a divorce from Demi Moore. So, Kilmer was brought in when suddenly, and certainly coincidentally, Kilmer himself got served divorce papers from his wife at the time, Joanne Whaley. Kilmer already had a reputation as an asshole, but this certainly kicked him into overdrive. The first director for the movie, Richard Stanley, was only on the job for 3 days, and he already knew that he did not like Kilmer, saying, quote, "Val would arrive, and an argument would happen," end quote. John Frankenheimer, who replaced Stanley, was much more blunt, saying, quote, "I don't like Val Kilmer. I don't like his work ethic, and I don't want to be associated with him ever again," end quote. Stanley had been wanting to do this film for decades by the time that he finally got the green light. Problems were apparent even before filming started. Kilmer would arrive a couple of days late to set. By the time he arrived, they started losing talent. On the second day of filming, Rob Morrow left, citing the tensions and hostility that permeated the movie set, as well as the weather. On the third day, Stanley was fired by New Line Cinema because he couldn't control Kilmer. The man literally had his dream movie, a movie that he'd been developing for years, crushed in 72 hours. If nothing else, this was a mentally violent experience for Stanley, who would not direct another movie for 23 years. He was replaced by John Frankenheimer, who decided to throw away the script that they already had and have it rewritten by Ron Hutchinson. When they restarted shooting a week later, exactly nothing was fixed, and things, in fact, got worse. Marlon Brando would sometimes just refuse to film, and he and Kilmer hated each other, which, quote, resulted in the cast and crew being kept waiting for hours, with each actor refusing to come out of his respective trailer before the other, end quote. In one incident, either intentionally or on accident, Kilmer burned a cameraman with a cigarette apparently on their face. Once Kilmer's last scene was done, Frankenheimer reportedly said, quote, "Cut, now get that bastard off my set," end quote. There was an undercurrent of worry among the execs too. Richard Stanley joked that the production designer should burn the set down, but New Line was legitimately worried that Stanley would try to sabotage the project, so they tightened up security. Stanley in fact did sneak back onto the set in full costume and moonlighted as an extra on the film that he was supposed to direct before he was unceremoniously fired. Kilmer apparently at least apologized to Stanley for playing a role in his removal. In a 2017 interview, Ron Hutchinson, the screenwriter, put it best, quote, "Everybody behaved monstrously to each other," end quote. It's been widely accepted that some level of creative differences is good for a movie. Friction and clashes help hone one's decision-making process and can help refine an idea into its most perfect form, unless that idea is the island of Dr. Moreau. Violence, physical or mental, is not necessary to make a great movie, and while a lot of great movies have troubled shoots, few have violent shoots. Sometimes all you need for good work is good people. The only exception to this might be Werner Herzog and Klaus Kinski, but they're both special cases anyways.